There is a promise that shows up in family trees across this country, whispered from one generation to the next. Somewhere back there, someone says we had native blood. A surname, a family story, a grandmother's cheekbones, proof enough, or so it seemed. For decades, that promise felt solid. A name on a census roll, a spit test in the mail, a percentage on a screen. Case closed. Except it was never that simple. And the deeper researchers looked into the surnames themselves, the names families have carried for generations as evidence of native ancestry, the more the story started to come apart at the seams. Not because the ancestry wasn't real. Something far more complicated was hiding underneath these names. Something that has less to do with biology than most people assume, and far more to do with conquest, paperwork, and survival. This is the story of 14 surnames long associated with Native American heritage, what DNA can and cannot actually tell you about them, and why the answer researchers eventually landed on is more unsettling and more important than a simple percentage ever could be. For most of the last century, the accepted story was straightforward. Certain surnames, some clearly translated from indigenous languages, some adopted from historical figures, some simply common among specific reservation communities, were treated as inherited markers of tribal descent. If your family carried one of these names, and family stories backed it up, that was generally accepted as enough. Genealogists built family trees around these names. Direct-to-consumer DNA companies built entire marketing campaigns around them, promising customers a percentage breakdown that could supposedly confirm what the surname already suggested. The logic seemed sound. A name passed down through generations paired with a genetic test should be able to verify ancestry the way it does with many other groups. This felt reasonable because, for other populations, ancestry testing often works reasonably well. European ancestry, broadly speaking, correlates with regional genetic clusters that have been extensively studied and catalogued. So the assumption followed naturally. Surely the same logic applied here too. Family stories reinforced it further. A great-great-grandmother said to have been part of a specific nation. A surname that sounded, or was translated to sound, distinctly indigenous. A grandparent's photograph, studied for features rather than documents. None of this was presented dishonestly in most cases. It was simply how ancestry had always been discussed in households across the country, through memory, resemblance, and inherited names, long before genetic testing entered the picture at all. It didn't. And the first sign that something didn't fit came from an unexpected place. Not the DNA labs, but the tribal nations themselves. Long before any genetic study raised concerns, tribal governments and enrolled citizens had already been saying something that much of the public had not fully absorbed. Tribal identity was never simply a matter of blood percentage. It was and remains a political and legal relationship, citizenship in a sovereign nation, established through documented lineage, treaty rights, and enrollment criteria set by each tribe individually, not by a laboratory. That distinction should have been the first clue. A DNA test cannot confer citizenship in any nation. Not Canada. Not France. Not a federally recognized tribal nation. Yet millions of DNA kits were being sold with the implicit promise that they could reveal, and in some sense validate, exactly that. That mismatch was the first crack. This is where genetics, as a science, actually entered the conversation, not to confirm the old assumption, but to explain, patiently, why it was built on a shaky foundation to begin with. Autosomal DNA tests, the kind sold by most consumer companies, work by comparing your genetic markers against reference populations, groups of people whose ancestry is already well documented, geographically and historically. For this comparison to mean anything, the reference population has to be large, diverse, and accurately sampled. For indigenous peoples of the Americas, that reference data has historically been thin, inconsistent, and in many cases ethically fraught. Many tribal nations have restricted participation in genetic databases, citing a long, documented history of researchers extracting biological material without informed consent, misusing it, or using findings to challenge tribal sovereignty and land claims. The result is a genetic reference landscape for Native America that is nowhere near as complete as the one built for European populations. This means a company can, in some cases, tell you that you carry a genetic marker broadly associated with indigenous ancestry in the Americas. What it usually cannot do, no matter how confidently the report is formatted, is tell you which specific tribal nation that ancestry connects to, because the underlying genetic tools were never built with that level of resolution for this population. If a DNA report says which fraction of your ancestry, in percentage form, connects to a broad continental category, it is telling you something real but limited. If it appears to name a specific tribe, that claim deserves far more scrutiny than the confident graphic suggests. If topics like this interest you, where the science turns out to be more careful and more honest than the marketing around it, consider subscribing because there is a lot hiding beneath the surface of these stories. The DNA did not simply confirm the old assumption. It complicated it, and then it complicated the surnames themselves. Because once researchers and historians started tracing the actual origin of many surnames associated with native heritage, a second layer of the story emerged, one with far less to do with biology and far more to do with policy. A significant number of surnames long treated as markers of indigenous descent did not originate organically within tribal naming traditions at all. They were imposed. Federal Indian boarding schools, operating from the late 19th century well into the 20th, forcibly assigned English surnames to indigenous children as part of a deliberate assimilation policy, stripping away original names, languages, and family structures in an attempt to erase tribal identity entirely. Other surnames trace back to missionaries, government agents, or Indian agency officials who recorded family names on rolls using whatever spelling or translation was convenient at the time, often inconsistently, sometimes incorrectly, occasionally assigning the same surname to unrelated families simply because it was administratively easier. And some surnames genuinely did descend from respected tribal leaders or family lines, carried forward with intention and pride across generations, preserved specifically because the name mattered. All three of these histories exist, tangled together, sometimes within the very same family. That is not a contradiction. That is a signal that the surname alone was never a reliable proxy for ancestry, because the naming system itself was shaped as much by colonization as by kinship. At this point, three explanations for the same surname could plausibly apply, and only careful historical and genealogical research, not a genetic test, could begin to sort out which one applied to any specific family. The first is documented tribal descent, where oral history, tribal enrollment records, treaty-era documentation, or mission records confirm a direct, traceable line to a specific indigenous community. This is the strongest and most reliable form of evidence, and it exists for many families. The second is assimilation-era imposition, where a name was assigned by a boarding school, missionary, or federal agent, disconnected from any personal tribal lineage of the specific person who received it, yet still carried forward by descendants as though it were an inherited family name in the conventional sense. The third is regional or cultural adjacency, where a family lived near, worked alongside, or intermarried with a tribal community over generations, absorbing a name, a story, or a cultural association without a documented genetic or citizenship connection to back it up. None of these explanations are shameful. Each reflects a real, if very different, piece of American history. But only one of them describes actual tribal descent in the way most people assume when they see a surname and call it proof. There is a fourth pattern worth naming carefully, because it complicates things further rather than simplifying them. In some families, more than one of these histories is true at once. A genuine ancestral connection to a specific nation exists somewhere in the tree, but it sits alongside a name that was separately imposed through an entirely different, unrelated colonial process a generation or two later. Untangling the two requires patient archival work, tribal records, and often direct engagement with the nation in question. It cannot be shortcut by a cheek swab, no matter how the results are packaged. The most significant turning point in this story did not come from a single ancestry company. It came from a broader body of research conducted by population geneticists working directly with tribal nations, using ancient DNA recovered from pre-contact sites across the Americas, compared against carefully consented modern samples from specific, willing tribal communities. This research mattered because it was built differently from commercial testing. It prioritized tribal sovereignty over data collection speed, worked within ethical frameworks tribal governments helped shape, and focused on population-level history rather than individual identity verification. And what it revealed reshaped the entire conversation. Unlike a commercial kit, this kind of research typically takes years, involves formal agreements between scientists and tribal governments, and often results in findings that are shared first with the communities involved before ever reaching a wider audience. It is slower, more limited in scope, and far less profitable than a mail-order test, which is part of why the picture it paints is so different from the one sold to consumers. The genetic history of indigenous peoples in the Americas is not a single, uniform lineage waiting to be matched against a customer database. It reflects multiple ancient migration waves stretching back over 10,000 years, deep regional diversification across North, Central, and South America, and centuries of complex movement, trade, and intermarriage between distinct nations long before European contact ever began. In other words, there was never one genetic signature called Native American for a test to detect in the first place. There were, and are, hundreds of distinct peoples, each with their own ancestral history, only some of which have chosen to participate in genetic research at all. The twist, then, is not a dramatic revelation about a hidden bloodline. It is something quieter and in some ways more important. Not a story about DNA finally proving tribal heritage. A story about DNA revealing why it was never capable of proving that in the first place, and why the surname on your family tree was carrying a far more complicated history than a percentage on a screen could ever summarize. The genome was not erasing these family stories. It was revealing an older, messier truth beneath them, one where identity, sovereignty, and survival were never reducible to biology alone. This is bigger than 14 surnames, and bigger than any single family tree. What this research suggests is that the entire premise many people grew up with, that ancestry can be verified the same way for every population, using the same tools, with the same confidence, was built on an assumption that simply does not hold for indigenous peoples of the Americas. Their history was shaped not only by migration and kinship, the way every human population's history is, but by centuries of deliberate policy designed to disconnect people from exactly the records a genealogist or geneticist would need. That disconnection was not an accident. It was, in many documented cases, the explicit goal of federal assimilation policy, and its effects still shape what can and cannot be proven today, generations later. It also means the burden of proof has, in a very real sense, been placed unevenly. A family descended largely from well-documented European immigration can often trace lineage through church records, ship manifests, and census data stretching back centuries with relative ease. A family with genuine indigenous ancestry may find that the very records needed to confirm that lineage were destroyed, falsified, or never created in the first place, not because the ancestry wasn't real, but because the systems responsible for documentation were, for long stretches of history, actively working against preserving it. Understanding that asymmetry changes how a missing record should be read. An absence of paperwork is not evidence of an absent ancestor. Sometimes it is evidence of exactly the opposite. A family that survived a system built to erase the very proof it now seems to be missing. Picture a stretch of high plains at dawn, grass moving in long silver waves toward a horizon with no visible edge. Somewhere along that land, generations ago, a family's name was written down by someone else's hand, in someone else's language, on a ledger meant to count people rather than know them. The name survived. The record survived. But the fuller story, who that family really was, where they came from, what nation they belonged to, was never fully written down at all, because the system doing the writing was never built to preserve it. That gap in the record is not empty. It is simply unrecovered, and in some cases, it may never be fully recoverable, no matter how advanced the science becomes. If this kind of story changes how you think about a name on your own family tree, let me know in the comments which population or hidden history you'd want covered next. The old story said a surname, paired with a DNA test, could finally prove tribal heritage, clean, simple, confirmed. The evidence suggests something far more layered. Some surnames do carry real, documented tribal descent, verifiable through tribal records and oral history maintained by the nations themselves. Others carry the residue of assimilation policy, missionary record-keeping, or regional proximity, real history, but not the history the name seems to imply at first glance. Genetics can tell you something about deep, ancient population history. It cannot, on its own, tell you which sovereign nation you belong to, because that question was never a biological one to begin with. It is a question of citizenship, community, and relationship, decided by tribal nations according to their own laws, not by a laboratory in a strip mall or an algorithm comparing your markers to an incomplete reference panel. The map people built out of surnames and spit kits was never wrong because people were dishonest. It was too small for what actually happened here, a history involving migration across 10,000 years, and a more recent history involving forced removal, forced naming, and deliberate erasure that no genetic test was ever designed to undo. What survives, in the end, is not a percentage. It is the harder, more human work of documentation, relationship, and recognition, sustained by tribal nations themselves, in the face of a system that spent generations trying to make that work impossible. For anyone who grew up believing a surname settled the question, that can feel like an unsatisfying ending. It is not meant to be a dismissal. Many of the families carrying these 14 names do have real, documented, and deeply meaningful connections to specific nations, connections upheld not by a lab report, but by relatives, records, and communities who know exactly who belongs and why. The point is not that the ancestry is false. The point is that the proof was never going to come from a cheek swab in the first place. The map is still incomplete. It may stay that way. That is not a failure of the science. It may be the most honest thing the DNA has ever told us, that some truths were never meant to be reduced to a single test, and some forms of belonging were never for a laboratory to decide.